Hey everybody, today we're looking at section 10.3 fermentation, which will wrap up chapters 9 and 10 for us at this point. So this is not the longest section that we'll go through and not the longest section that you've been through. So hopefully the screencast won't take as much time as some of the other ones have, all right? So go ahead and put down the heading for me, section 10.3, fermentation. What we're looking at here on this slide are some examples of single-celled organisms like yeast that can do this process of fermentation. And if you've never heard of fermentation, chances are you have eaten food produced by this process. So this is not something that is completely kind of out there. This is something that we all kind of tend to do on a daily basis, and the products of this process are in our daily lives, without a doubt. Okay. So looking at the learning objectives here for this section, we're looking at how organisms, this can be prokaryotes, eukaryotes, how they obtain energy in the absence of oxygen. And also we're going to consider two different types of fermentation and how our bodies use fermentation in order to obtain energy when we're doing strenuous activities like exercising. Okay. So when we talk about fermentation is really a process that's going to allow us to continue making ATP when we lack oxygen. So what that means, if you think back to what we did in 10.1 and 10.2, well, the first stage of aerobic respiration, as we called it, involved something called glycolysis. And glycolysis was occurring out in the cytoplasm, which means all living things can do it, and it's an anaerobic process. What fermentation will allow is this kind of works hand in hand with glycolysis when we lack oxygen in our cells. And how this works, well, glycolysis, if you remember, takes glucose and it'll break that glucose down. Fermentation simply allows that process to continue. So the energy carriers that we make in glycolysis, fermentation kind of recycles those back and allows them to continue to be used as like intermediate molecules and precursors so that we can continue breaking down glucose in an effective way. Okay, so fermentation here, definitely you want to get the definition for this one. And then I would also jot down this second item here, which is that fermentation by itself doesn't actually produce any ATP on its own. Okay, it's not like the Krebs cycle or the ETC or glycolysis in that it even makes like two, it makes none, zero ATP. The only thing it does is it allows glycolysis to continue making the few ATP that it can make. And if you remember, glycolysis creates a net gain of 2 ATP in a cell. So it's not nearly as much as what we get out of the electron transport chain, but still 2 ATP is going to be helpful if you're in desperate need of energy. Okay. I really like the diagram here at the bottom because it helps to give you a good idea of these pathways. So ideally, when we have oxygen, we're going to go the route of glycolysis and aerobic respiration in the mitochondria, and we're going to make, we'll make our 36 to 40 ATP as a result, right? I mean, that would be the ideal conditions. When you're doing things like strenuous exercise, or if we're talking about things like yeast and we're trying to bake things like bread, we're going to deprive those things of oxygen. And when that happens, we only get, again, a grand total of 2 ATP. So there's a significant difference here, right? The ideal scenario is not to do fermentation, but it's kind of there as a backup. And that's the way I like to think about it. This is like our backup plan. If we run out of oxygen, we still have something we can do. Okay. So looking at the overview of this. So we have two different types of fermentation here. We have what we call alcoholic fermentation here on the left, and then we have lactic acid fermentation here on the right of the screen. Both of them, if you notice, are occurring out in the cytoplasm, so that's not different. What is different is what types of organisms can do these two processes. So humans do not do alcoholic fermentation. Humans will do lactic acid fermentation. And we do this specifically in places like our muscles and our liver, where we need kind of a constant supply of energy. Okay. And especially in those types of organs where we know we are, working them a lot when we do things like exercise. Alcoholic fermentation is done by some types of plants and yeast and other maybe simpler organisms, and they produce different byproducts as a result of this. Instead of producing lactic acid like we do in our muscles, they produce ethyl alcohol, which is the same thing we find in things like wine and beer and any type of liquor or alcoholic beverage that you could think of, right? I mean, this is the reason why we call it alcoholic fermentation. So yes, certainly we don't do that process, but there are lots of other organisms that we can manipulate to produce those types of products and do that process. Lactic acid, just by the way, if you think about what you maybe heard about lactic acid, that is the kind of the source of that burning sensation that you get in your muscles sometimes after you exercise. And generally, you can burn that off and get rid of it by doing something like stretching. Okay. So here are those two different types again, alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation. And I would make sure you definitely write down the names of those here. Okay. Really, as you can see, same type of process occurring on both sides. Like all of this up here remains the same. The components that are going to be different are the products we get out at the bottom and then the CO2 that gets released as part of alcoholic fermentation. All right. So when we look at, let's see, alcoholic fermentation first, here, again, we've got yeast and some microorganisms that can do this process. And carbon dioxide is going to be a byproduct of it. And so you see here are the two products that are going to be, I guess, maybe a little bit different than what we see as compared to lactic acid fermentation. So the one that kind of stands out in this case is going to be here, alcohol and also CO2. We use this process in doing things like making pizza crust and bread, because if you've ever seen or heard or have actually maybe done it yourself, you add the yeast and you add some sugar, which we know, glucose here represents that in a cell. You kind of mix those things together and then you cover it up. And then over time, what ends up happening is that bread will actually rise and it gets larger in size. And that's because of all these CO2 bubbles, all the CO2 gas that's released by the yeast that are actively doing this fermentation process. Okay, the alcohol also is there that will kind of burn off when you do things like cook the bread. But sometimes, rising bread takes on a distinct smell of something like alcohol as a result. Okay. And it's because of the products that we get through this process. Again, the key is yeast, again, can do lots of different processes in terms of making energy, but to drive this process, we have to keep them covered and kind of deprived of oxygen, okay, to actually get that rise in something like bread. Lactic acid fermentation, on the other hand, this is this diagram here on the right. That's what we do in our muscles and in our liver. All right, so in terms of our products that we get out of this, we do not produce CO2, but we do produce lactic acid, and that's the one kind of defining feature. That's why we call this lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid is what you would think it would be, right? It is acidic. That's why it creates that kind of burning sensation in places like your muscle, okay, after hard exercise. So we get lactic acid out of it. And both of these processes, if you notice on the last slide, they also will both create this NAD+, which is what we need here to continue this glycolysis process. If we don't have that there, then we cannot, in a cell, continue breaking down glucose. So again, regardless of which pathway we take, whether it's, lactic acid fermentation there on the right or alcoholic fermentation here on the left, the goal is going to be the same. It's to allow glycolysis to continue working and to continue producing that NAD with a little positive charge that we need to make NADH as an energy carrier. Okay. So last couple slides here for this section. So we like to use, when we talk about like quick bursts of energy, like a sprint or a quick swim, not something that would be like a marathon in length or an Ironman, right? That's long-term energy. When we think about quick bursts of energy, we like to use ATP that's already available in muscles and ATP that we can make through lactic acid fermentation. Now, this is not something, if you go out and run a marathon, 26.2 miles, you're not going to be doing lactic acid fermentation the entire time, but you will be using kind of a constant supply of ATP. And for any kind of like short, quick bursts, like let's say you have to run up a hill or, I don't know, jump out of someone's way or something, that may require the production of lactic acid through this process, okay? So really, it's short, quick bursts of energy that are necessary where we get lactic acid fermentation in our muscles. Anything that's long-term is going to continue to be made through aerobic respiration with glycolysis, Krebs, and ETC. So again, you've got that here. For exercise longer than about 90 seconds, respiration is really the only way to continue generating ATP. And if you struggle to continue generating ATP, that's when your body will kind of shut down, right? I mean, if you can't generate ATP to do things like your heart pumping, then that would be a significant problem. Okay, so again, Krebs, ETC, glycolysis, all of that is aerobic. That's what we use for long-term energy. Fermentation and glycolysis are both anaerobic, and we use those two processes together when we need either a short, quick burst of energy, or if we're something like a yeast cell and we're completely deprived of energy, not energy, excuse me, completely just deprived of oxygen. Okay. That's all I have for fermentation. As with all of these, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will talk about this later, and make sure you get the rest of your homework done. Okay. Bye. See y'all later.